Today we're going to be talking yet more about manuscripts, which Jeff talked about for the last two classes, but we'll now talk a bit about the physical form that they took. So I call it back to the books because books, even manuscript books of one sort or another, what we're going to be concerned with before going on to print. But first, any leftover, hangover, beginning of the semester, administrative questions we need to deal with? We've shaken down the course. There are openings in media studies. Cognitive science has to shake out its list, but there should be enough room there. Is there anybody still having trouble? If there is, perhaps don't bring it up now, but come and talk to me or Blake at the end of the class. But in theory, I think there is a seat for everybody and everybody for a seat. So any other administrative questions of general issue rather than personal in particular that anyone thinks that we might need to address? Okay, so let's get on to business. And sort of any other business, but not quite. We will, and I'll talk about this at the end of the class, be reading two people on print, two people who actually famously battled with each other. A wonderful academic war, if you want to follow it up. Elizabeth Eisenstein and Adrian Johns. Adrian Johns has also, in fact, in his first book, The Nature of the Book, he writes a lot about this, written about piracy. And he's written this very good book on the history of piracy, bringing it right up to the present, the notion of piracy. He's also written a very good book for the Anglos in the class on radio piracy, and how there are a lot of pirate radios that try to vie with the BBC. He's a very good writer, he's very interesting, and he'll be on campus next Thursday. And well worth listening to, he talks very well. So if you're interested in the issue of piracy, I think you'll find him well worth going to. We've asked you, and I'll talk a bit about this at the end, to read a little bit of his work for next week, and if that whets your appetite, we'll be talking about him on Tuesday, and it's Thursday that he's here. So just a heads up on that. Also, in the sort of general line of business before we get down to today's topic, Jeff was talking last week about Goody and lists and Goody's idea. Interesting idea. I mean, my world is full of them. I write lists all the time. But lists, in a way, Goody claims, transform the nature of human society. So it's again one of those, and we'll be meeting many of them, great transformative arguments, and this is one of the earliest, because as Jeff said, here's the first information technology writing, and Goody comes along and says, once we have writing, we have lists, and once we have lists, all sorts of things happen. Well, where in your lives have a new form of list been, as many would claim, transformative? In fact, claimed only yesterday, as transformative as the printing press. Any thoughts of a new kind of list? Yes? Maybe Facebook. The idea of suddenly... Sorry, and you are? Sorry? Nikita? Yeah, Nikita. Okay, I'll keep trying to remember. Nikita, thank you. Yeah, so, I mean, the way in which we think of what a friend is now, I mean, we still have personal friends, but there's this other kind of classification, not only in which we add people under slightly different criteria, but that we publish to the world. And we say, these are my friends, and then you get these weird petitions, please can I be your friend? You haven't heard that since you were in grade school, and suddenly it's coming round again with these adults, and these corporations want to be your friend. So, again, here we have a little bit of Goody, suddenly with a new technology, reinventing itself in such a remarkable way that for perhaps 75 billion, this company is about to go public, based all on the old Goody notion of lists. So lists are powerful things, and still remain powerful things in the world today as in the past. And it's worth, as we go on, thinking a little bit about how the new technology in some ways is reflecting some of those arguments. Because Zuckerberg himself doesn't quite have the wit to say, well, we're just like Jack Goody, but he does sit up, and we'll talk about this a little next time, say quite happily, we're just like Gutenberg. Not since the printing press, he says, has there been anything like Facebook. So people like to make these grand claims that we've been talking about. Okay, so where are we going today? The readings, as you saw, you might be able to think of in some way as bookends. That is, Jeff took us up to more or less 500 before the Common Era, when writing and manuscript was starting, when the alphabet was, it's a slightly strange word, but invented, and manuscript was starting to circulate. And Plato, who we asked you to read, is right there as an eyewitness, right at the beginning. He is talking about what happens when this new technology comes along, and that's why we asked you to read that piece. And then Ptolemaios, in a way, comes just as you will have realized as the printing press comes out. So he's the bookend at the other end. Here we have someone who says, well, here's writing and the book of a sort, and he actually talks in one way or another of a book, and here's Ptolemaios saying, what happens to your life, which is based on writing when the printing press comes along. So these are very much our eyewitnesses to history. And one of the things we have to deal with, going back to an earlier slide, I said that, there's a period in which we attempt to say nothing happened. What's up? Not much. Because we don't really seem to say, well, there was writing, and then there was printing. And in between can seem like a vast hollow. So what we're going to do today is to look into that in-between period and see what it has to tell us. So the overview is, we're going to deal first with the eyewitnesses. You may remember I put up on the slide at the beginning, sort of saying why we're looking at history. One reason is, what we're trying to do, what George Young suggested, is find out what people felt about it at the time. If, as we claim, we're going through a major transformation, we're kind of interested in how we feel, and you, I suspect, have an interest in thinking how differently you seem to feel about new technology and enthusiasm to Facebook versus me with my complete loathing of Facebook. So we want to see what the eyewitnesses at the time felt like, and so we're going to ask that question. Then we're going to go on to this question of the technologies of the book. And one odd thing when you look at general literature is the idea that the book comes with the printing press. Well, we've already suggested that it doesn't. I'm going to look at one of the earlier technologies, and some of the very significant technologies still with us today that are important to thinking about the book. And one question that comes out of that, and something we'll return to several times, we'll return with printing, we'll return when we talk about science, we'll return to, is the authority that comes with a particular inscription of communication. So how do I know that I can trust or believe? And that comes immediately in the Socratic dialogue. Plato talks straight away about this question of who can you trust, and what's reliable, and what is truth. And that runs through, in many ways, this course, and we'll be bringing up some of that today. And questions is that when you start to shift to a culture that is based on writing, all sorts of tricky questions about trust and reliability come up. And then, as we have mentioned before, one thing to look at when people are making grand predictions about what a technology will do, and again, you should have noticed that Socrates brings this up almost immediately. Can you trust people's predictions about what they've invented are going to do? And so what are some of the unintended consequences of moving into the world of manuscripts? So that's the overview. We begin with our two witnesses, Plato, who was writing about Socrates, his teacher, and that book came out about 360 BC, they said, more or less. So very close to the dawn of the alphabet, and then Johannes Ptolemaios. All right, so let's begin with Plato. The setup. Anybody willing to tell us what happens on the first page or so of the reading? What's the setup that sets up the text? I'm sorry. Phaedrus, yeah. He hadn't quite been good, but he hadn't quite talked to Lysias. What had he in fact been doing? Well, if he'd been, anyone want to give a little refine on that a bit, yes? Right, so he has the text, so he'd read, but he'd also listened to a speech by Lysias. Yeah, were you going to add something more? Okay, so Phaedrus has come from doing that, all full of enthusiasm, and holding this scroll in his hand, and what then happens? Yes, and you are, sorry? Vilma? Right. So Socrates says, let's take a walk. And Socrates is kind of famous for saying and saying in the city and doesn't like the world outside. Right. It's so important that he's going to take that. Now, in a way, he's being a little disingenuous when he says he wants to hear what Lysias has said. Because, can we say, yes, and you are? Janet? Yeah. Well, partly he wants to read it, that's true, but anything else? What do we feel his view of Lysias is? Do you get a sense of his view of Lysias? Well, Lysias is what's called a sophist, from which we get modern words. Sophomore. Well, yeah, that's very nice. That's true. Other than that, well, I have wisdom, because the sophomore's wise, because wisdom is in there. Well, anything else? I'll block that comment. I hope we didn't get on tape, but the sophomore's in the room. Yes. Sophistry. We also get the term sophistry. So we get this mixture of wisdom, but also deception thrown in. So they go for this walk together, and he says, look, I really want to hear that speech you've got. And first he says, Phaedrus says, well, I'll recite the speech from memory. And Socrates kind of says, I don't think it's entirely from memory. Why? Remember? Yes. Right, so he actually notices that Phaedrus has the scroll under his cloak. And here I should perhaps again not on tape. Socrates was always famous for chasing beautiful young men around town whenever he saw them. There's some suggestion there's a kind of dirty joke about this thing, about because you can imagine if you hold the scroll. Well, I won't go into it, but you get my point. So anyway, so he says, okay, so what's going on here? Here's this speech, you're going to read it, you're going to recite it, but we'll talk about it. So he goes to the speech. Did anyone notice what that argument was about? Okay, come back a little to what I've just been saying. There's a little bit where he gives a synopsis of the argument that Lysias has been making. Yes? Right, so he wants to turn everything around and say somebody who doesn't love you is going to be a better suitor than someone who does. The only little thing I have to change there is because Socrates is actually about a man being in love with another man, not a woman being in love with another man. But the point is basic, exactly, and generalizes to that point. Should you take a lover or a proposed lover who says they don't love you than one who does? And this is Lysias' trick, is to turn around and invert what our initial instincts are to accept it. And Socrates, again, wants to look at that. What's going on? Is that, as the word has come up, sophistry? And what do we think of that? So that's all in there. But he then breaks off at the end. So we go through that argument, and I didn't ask you to read the whole of that argument. It is very interesting. And if any of you got enthusiastic for Plato now, you can read the whole thing. But then he comes through, you can find it online, we just give you the excerpts in the book. And towards the end, he suddenly says, well, what I really want to talk about is on the propriety and impropriety of writing and the conditions which determine them. So he comes back now to the question is, look, writing. And is writing proper in some way? And how should we think about it? And in order to set up that discussion, he tells the story of these three, of the three, two of them, Thamus and Theuth and Thebes. Can anybody take us very quickly through Thamus, Theuth and Thebes, what the story is? Famous? Good man. Yes, I'm sorry, you are. Adam. You won't lose points if you can't remember who's who. I always have to remember which of us. Yeah. Okay, all right. That's the king, that's the god. Mm-hmm. Can you remember what the others are, just by the way? Geometry is one. Anyone can remember the algebra? I mean, he's a smart guy. He invented it. Zuckerberg, eat your heart out. This is a real smart guy. Okay. Right. So he's invented various things. Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. So Socrates wants to tell us this story about how writing comes into being, and he goes to this Egyptian story of Thebes, the Egyptian Thebes, Karnak as it later became, and tells the story. We have this guy who invents it, and he comes along and says, I've got a really great idea, it's going to change the world. And instead of Thamus saying, let's go public with it, we'll call Morgan Stanley and have a public offering, he's actually rather skeptical and says, look, I'm not really interested in this stuff. Now, from the telling of that story, what I would call the standard view then that comes out about Socrates is that Socrates didn't like the book. Here's this guy who thinks books are bad. And yet, in fact, if you read the text, as you all I'm sure did, you'll notice that he actually doesn't quite say that, although that's the standard view, because in fact one of the reasons, we'll leave the others aside, that he wants to follow Phaedrus is he says, I'm a lover of learning. Men lead hungry animals by waving a branch or some vegetables before their noses, and it looks to me as if you will lead me all over Attica, remember he didn't want to leave the town, and anywhere else you please, by waving the leaves of a speech before me. And in fact, sometimes in the old Jowett translation, that's translated as a book. So in fact, the idea that he doesn't like books is a little problematic, because he's saying, look, I'll follow anybody who's got a book if I want to know what the argument is. And in fact, we also learned that Plato, who's writing this down, this is Socrates' pupil, had such a love of books that he bought 3 books at the price of 10,000 denarii, which we assume is a lot. And Aristotle acquired a few books for 3 Attic talents, which amount to 72,000 new, which again we assume is a lot. Who told us that? Clearly, thank you. Trithemius told us that. I'm sure you all remember it well. So there's evidence later, and in fact Aristotle's library becomes an enormously important and influential library. So the simple argument that he didn't like books, we have to reject. There's a more complex argument going on, and we've actually got to a little bit of it in this discussion, where this is actually the exchange between Thamus and Theuth, and Theuth says it's an accomplishment which will improve both the wisdom and the memory of the Egyptians. So he's making the claim it's going to make everything better. The response from the rather skeptical Thamus is to begin with a great line, I think. The discoverer of an art is not the best judge of the good or harm which will accrue to those who practice it. So he said, look, there are all people who are really good inventors, but that doesn't mean you'll know what's the best thing that will happen for your invention. And I think it's sort of almost universally true through history. We will see lots and lots of inventions in information technology where the person who invented the idea that the telephone would be for broadcasting opera, that was just a little off. So it's a good point. But then he goes on to the famous claim, those who acquire it will cease to exercise their memory and become forgetful. They will rely on writing to bring things to their remembrance by external signs instead of on their own internal resources. So there's this attack saying a new technology is going to destroy memory. And in fact, we've met that already. I talked about these books that said you as a generation are kind of doomed because these new technologies are going to wipe out your brains. There'll be nothing in there but mush and video games. Right? So these predictions come around from fairly serious people again and again. But let's try to get a little more to what Socrates' actual concerns were. Well, we talked about some. He talked about speeches. And he's not sure he likes speeches. He's also talks a bit about rhetoric. But again, he's suspicious of rhetoric, because rhetoric is something that can fool us, that can lead us astray. And therefore, as I said, and we discussed, he's suspicious of the sophists and puts them aside. And in fact, at one point he says that you may remember that politicians are reluctant to write down their speeches. Would that be true today, alas? But he's reluctant because they don't want to be mistaken for sophists. They don't want to be thought of as sophists. And he's then suspicious of writing. And there's a slight shift there. So is that the same thing, his suspicion of writing and his suspicion of these other things, would you say? Anyone have an opinion on that? Well, the things that I would say that he is concerned with are truth. That's the great Socratic search. And perhaps on top of that, a slightly different notion of wisdom, something which is more personalized. People have wisdom in a way. And then there's the perhaps more complex notion of the dialectic, a term which is usually associated with Marx, but here far deeper roots are with Socrates. And we can see him sort of talking about some of these issues, writing, his concern with writing. Writing circulates equally among those who understand the subject and those who have no business with it. So the trouble is with a piece of writing is I can have a piece of writing, and it happens all the time. We walk around with copies of Foucault or Derrida under our arm, and we get to like people to believe, therefore, we understand the French theories just off the top of our head. So he's got something that's still current then. For wisdom, he says, your pupils will have the reputation for it without the reality. So that they'll look smart, but they may not be smart. They will receive a quantity of information without proper instruction, and consequently be thought very knowledgeable when they are, for the most part, quite ignorant. And then he has this odd line about truth, which I'll come back to in a minute. Truth is not enough for you, he says. You think it matters who the speaker is and where he comes from. Can you remember where he says that? Can you remember where he says that? It's an odd line that he suddenly puts in. It's actually, he snaps at Phaedrus at this point. Phaedrus says, look, how come you go off to Egypt to tell me this elaborate story to illustrate the problems with writing? And Socrates snaps back and says, truth is not enough for you, and the story is true, he claims. You always want to know who said it and why. And that's an odd issue there. But then underneath all this, so the critique of what all this stuff about writing and the appearance of it is, in fact, comes up with the whole question of the dialectic. Writing involves a similar disadvantage to painting. If you ask words what they mean, they simply return the same answer over and over. Writing cannot distinguish between suitable and unsuitable readers. So writing is this inert kind of stuff. Whereas for him, the real thing is dialectic. And what is dialectic? Dialectic is actually what you were reading about. It's these two people walking around, talking to each other, arguing, exchanging ideas, testing whether they've got it right, testing whether they understand it, testing whether what they're being told is reasonable, is honest. So he says, when a man employs the art of dialectic and fastening upon a suitable soul, the suitable pupil, that is, in this case, plants and sows in it, in that soul, truths accompanied by knowledge. So people really get to know something. They don't just pick up this stuff and are able to spout it without understanding it. They really get to know and understand. Such truths can defend themselves, he says. So he's making a particularly important point, not simply about technology, but about the nature of learning. Remember, Jeff last time was talking all about the nature of transmission of knowledge before manuscript. You very much was what came to you from your parents or what people knew before. So Socrates is laying this pitch down that this is really what matters in learning. Is actually being able to ask questions, to fight, to push back, to doubt. Now, we've actually met this before, and to test Socrates' principle about whether memories are turning to mush, does anybody remember this man? So they're all right. Your brains have gone to mush. You can't remember a thing. You actually are probably all right. In fact, throughout history, there have been a bunch of people who said actually memory is a terrible thing. If you fill your mind with stuff you remember, you never think of anything. You never say anything very serious. Robert Hooke, who we'll meet, one of the founders of the Royal Society, said, good wits have ill memories. So if you want to be a real wit, you don't have a long memory. And Malebranche, the contemporary of Descartes, said memory confuses the mind. So you're in good company. But we did talk about this. That's also my excuse when I fail to remember your names. Because I'm too much of a wit to have a memory. We met Vicessimus Knox because he was the person who talked about the age of information. And I said how we had this odd figure back in the 18th century who was using the phrase the age of information already. But that's not what I'm so interested in at the moment is, if you remember, we read through this quotation and it was the way it ends. He said, look, the trouble with books is that not everybody can have them. Okay, a lot of poor people don't get them. But he says the other problem is, it's a well-known truth that the same precepts inculcated by a living instructor, adorned by proper oratory, enforced by serious and authoritative manner, produces a powerful effect not experienced in solitary retirement. So he's putting out this argument that, again, very like Socrates. Look, you need to be able to sit down and talk to someone who knows about this stuff, and that if you don't, you really won't get to understand it. Now, obviously, there's a huge gap between those two, and Vicessimus Knox is now talking about the printed book and a society, an age of information, but he still makes that Socratic claim. And in fact, that Socratic claim is still heard today. We'll talk about this later in the course to some extent when we talk about the social implications of the internet. It's deeply, deeply instilled in your lives, and in some ways you've taken one side of this debate. Now, how does it affect you? Well, it was a prediction back in 1932 that the People's University of the Air will have a greater student body than any of our universities put together. You've all come to university. But for years, people were saying you don't need universities anymore. And in fact, you come to class, maybe you'll stop. But webcasts are available throughout. You don't even have to come to Berkeley to have access to these webcasts. Or you can go to Khan Academy. Or indeed, you can go to the much talked about now Udacity. So, but the one critique of these places is a very Socratic critique, which says, well, no, you don't really learn so well by sitting and following these things. Sometimes you need what they say is a wise orator in front of you to exchange ideas with. So it's deeply instilled in how we think about communication, about knowledge, about information, about becoming learned. And we'll be talking about this as we go on. Socrates brings it up right there at the beginning when this first technology comes along and says, what does it do to that principle that people actually learn a lot by meeting face to face and exchanging ideas? Let's go on. Let's keep on rolling. To Tritemius, so our second witness. So this is the bookend now at the other end. We've had the manuscript for nearly 2,000 years by the time he comes along. I'll talk a little bit about what fills that gap, but let's go to the other end first. Tritemius, he was a native of Trittenheim in Germany, which is how he gets his name, and the abbot of this splendid place, the abbot of St. Martin's, Benedict Abbey in Germany. So what kind of is the setup in his story? It's a little tricky to get out. I imagine those of you who began De Laude Scriptorum Factori Sermonum Ilius Invocamus Auxilium didn't get a lot out of it, but if you managed to read the English side of the page, you could get a little more out of it. What was he telling us? What do you feel? It's a strange discussion. A lot of it is about religious life. But I don't get a sense of, yes, so you are? Karen? Right, and the point about Karen makes, because we're now here at the end of an era, and these people have been doing this, they're Benedictines, they've been doing it for 1,000 years by then. And suddenly something comes along, so we don't need to do all this copying. You've got the printing press. Yeah. Throw out the scriptorium.